The threat of politically inspired violence looms over every single facet of American civic life, thanks to a new round of threats from the ex-president and as revealed by a burst of brand new reporting on this topic. The prosecutors who have indicted Donald Trump face threats against them, their families, their kids, and their staffs. Democrats and Republicans are spending record sums on security for themselves and their families and their staff. Donald Trump last night renewed a smear against the media, first deployed during his presidency, by lashing out at the networks of NBC and MSNBC, calling us, quote, enemies of the people. Trump yesterday also attacked U.S. active duty military by accusing its top official of treason. And Trump didn't spare the public at large either. The ex-president and his allies have attacked the jurors, the grand jurors, and the vast jury pools in the various jurisdictions seeking to hold him accountable. That brand new reporting in the New York Times lays out just how law enforcement is seeking to respond to this unprecedented domestic threat environment. From that new reporting, quote, as the prosecutions of Trump have accelerated, so too have threats against law enforcement authorities, judges, elected officials, and others. The threats, in turn, are prompting protective measures, a legal effort to curb his angry and sometimes incendiary public statements, and renewed concern about the potential for an election campaign in which Trump has promised retribution to produce violence. What the surge in threats shows is that the disinformation, the grievances, the angry and violent rhetoric that led to the January 6th insurrection has shown no sign of petering out. As the New York Times reports, quote, in April, before federal prosecutors indicted Trump, one survey showed that 4.5% of American adults agree with the idea that the use of force was justified to restore Trump to the presidency. 2 months later, after the first federal indictment of Trump, that figure surged to 7%. One expert telling the Times this, quote, the indictments of Trump are the most important current drivers of political violence we now have. No, none of this would be happening without the support of the ex-president, who pours kerosene on the fire on a near-daily basis, with statements targeting his perceived political opponents, the media, and law enforcement officials who he believes stand in his way. Trump's rhetoric has spurred a request from the Justice Department for a narrowly tailored gag order. A legal battle between Jack Smith and Trump's attorneys is set to unfold dramatically this week, pushing the country into uncharted territory. New York Times reports this, quote, there is little precedent for how the judge overseeing the case, Tanya Chutkan, should think about how to weigh strong constitutional protections for political speech against ensuring the functioning of the judicial process and the safety of the people participating in it. It is one more example of the challenges of seeking to hold to account a norm-shattering former president who's being prosecuted in 4 cases as he makes another bid for the White House with a message that his opponents have weaponized the criminal justice system against him. Efforts to counter the threat of political violence emanating from Trump and Trumpism is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former FBI counterintelligence agent Pete Strzok is here. With me at the table, New York Times Washington correspondent and MSNBC national security contributor Mike Schmidt, whose byline is on a lot of that reporting we read from, is here, and MSNBC political analyst, the former Senator Claire McCaskill, is here. I want to start with you, Mike, and have you take us through your reporting, which seems to seek to connect the dots between the current threat environment, which we talk about a lot here, and all of the smears or posts or Truth Socials and all of the threats that have been realized. So you mentioned Obama had an would-be attacker outside of his residence. I believe he was doxxed on Trump's social media platform. Others, Democrats and Republicans, who have crossed wires with Trump now require security. We cover a lot of the prosecutors who are facing unprecedented threats. But more recently, this really remarkable filing from the Justice Department about what Jack Smith's team sees as a real threat to the very ability to put on a fair trial in D.C. because of the things Trump's been saying.
I think that one of the responsibilities that we have as journalists, especially with everything that's going on, is trying to capture a moment or what is going on currently by connecting different things. And to your point, if you step back and you look at all this stuff, whether you're a scholar or someone who monitors this stuff on a daily basis, or a politician or a law enforcement official, a lot of people seem to be saying the same thing. On top of that, you have tangible examples, arrests that have been made by people making threats. The FBI has fatally shot and killed 2 people over the past 13 months related to threats and such. So what we were trying to do is say, hey, there's a lot of stuff that's being said, but when you look at it all, this is a very unusual, extraordinary moment. And that's what we were trying to do, is try and tie all those pieces together, because there's a lot of developments that have happened. The arrest of the person outside of Obama's house, the calls into the judge, all of those stories got some attention, but they didn't get, we tried to put them all together into one place.
I mean, Pete Strzok, after 9/11, there were calls to declassify the PDB about bin Laden's desire to attack here in the U.S. Dick Clark was leading that charge. We don't need it here, right? It's all open source. The person who wanted to murder and kill Judge Chutkan, she was arrested before she carried out any violence. As Mike reported, the would-be Obama attacker, I believe there was someone wandering around a president's house, and Secret Service deals with that all the time. But in this environment, if anything happens to anyone, and we should say something has already happened. Paul Pelosi is attacked by a deranged person who spews conspiracy theories. You had a shooter in New Mexico who went around shooting Democratic election officials. January 6th happened, and every member of the House and every senator ran for their lives. If there's video of anyone not running, I haven't seen it yet. So something has already happened. What is it that makes this threat so difficult to stay ahead of?
Well, Nicole, I think anytime you have that stunning 7% that you cited of the population that believes it's justified, that violence might be justified in these circumstances, that's a huge number of people. When you look at a body of, 30 plus million people who voted for Trump, now not all 7% of those folks are going to take up arms, but if even a tiny percent of that portion decide that they are individually aggrieved, from a law enforcement perspective, it's one thing if you're trying to track what larger groups like the Oath Keepers of the Proud Boys are doing. And frankly, what we've seen from January 6th, it isn't clear to me that the federal government did a particularly good job of even those large groups understanding what they do. But when you start talking about 1 or 2 people, when you talk about folks like Cesar Sayoc, who was a Trump follower, who way back in 2019, 2020 was sending explosive devices to CNN, to George Soros, to Hillary Clinton, to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. These have been brewing for some time. And when you have the leader of the Republican Party who is going out, who continues to encourage violence, you are setting the stage for this grievance, and the idea that violence is justified in response to that grievance, that all we're waiting on is some sort of adverse ruling from a judge, some sort of adverse finding in a court of law, some sort of adverse result in a presidential election, that it takes this not just simmering sort of attitude, but one that's actively being encouraged by Trump. And I worry that any one of those events is enough to really push a number of small actors to violence in a way that federal and state and local law enforcement just don't have any ability to see coming. And that's what makes it so dangerous.